Thank Brother Jermaine for a wonderful piece of music. This morning, I'd like to share on the topic, the forbearance of God. And as we've read from the two texts, Exodus chapter 9 verse 16 and Exodus chapter 14 verse 30. Of course, we did read 9:6, but it should be 9 verse 16. In Exodus chapter 14 verse 30, we read these words: "And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore." I would like for a moment, you and me, to take a mental flight and go back to the shores of the Red Sea and behold the sight with the children of Israel. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. I believe it was rather a gruesome sight as they saw the bodies of the soldiers of the once proud army of Egypt scattered upon the seashore. Some had their heads pillowed peacefully as if in sleep, and others had their hard faces half buried in the sand. And yet others still were thrown on their backs with their eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. And as Israel looked at that sight of the once mighty army of Egypt, bodies and chariots scattered on the seashore, one body takes their attention. They looked at that body and they saw, with its rich costume and jeweled fingers, except that this time there is no crown on its head, neither a scepter in its hand. But the children of Israel could still recognize that this man was once the mighty ruler of Egypt. This was the body of Pharaoh. And now comes the big question that I'd like us to consider this morning. How came this famous Egyptian here? He was once a mighty king, and we all know that. He was a ruler over one of the proudest nations of his time. And here we find him dead on the seashore. He died away from home. And perhaps, not perhaps, he actually died a violent death. Let's, for a moment, take an inquiry into what actually happened for this mighty person to be lying on this shore. For sure, when Pharaoh led his army towards this place, he had no intention of dying on the shores of the Red Sea. He never intended that his life would end like that. Nor is he here because his enemy, the Israelites, had prevailed over him. What is the cause? What is the reason why Pharaoh finds himself here? And the question is answered by the voice of God in Exodus chapter 9 verse 16, where it reads, "For this cause have I raised thee up, that I might show forth my power in thee." Exodus chapter 9 verse 16. "For this cause, or for this reason, have I raised thee up, that I might show forth my power in thee." If you think about that text, it sounds rather strange. Pharaoh dead on the shores of Red Sea, and God saying, "For this reason I raised you up, that I might show forth my strength." It is a rather strange text because without the least equivocation, it says that God raised this man Pharaoh up that he might show forth his power in him. And that purpose God actually did accomplish. The ghastly piece of the royal rottenness that has not been, that's thrown on this seashore, this has not happened because of a hand of man. It actually happened because of the hand of God. And as we look at him in our minds, let's remember that he is here as a monument of the power of God. But strange to say, it is not a monument of God's power to save and to keep and to utilize. On the contrary, it is an indication of God's power to thwart, to disappoint, to wreck, and to utterly destroy. And in this destruction, God tells us that he achieved his purpose. You will agree with me that this is an amazing statement to say. The teaching seems to be that God raised Pharaoh that he might glorify himself by making of him a complete wreck. But I wonder if that can be true. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God raised Pharaoh to destroy him? Would you believe that? I suppose all of us who believe in the Bible, we can agree that God has a plan for every life. And all nature tells us of a planning God. All revelation teaches us that we have a God who plans. But we have the message direct from the lips of the Lord. As my Father has sent me, so I send you. God has plans and has purposes. But in admitting that God has plans for every life, we can believe that he plans, can we believe that he planned for some people to go wrong and be destroyed, and he planned for some people to go and do right? Could that be the plan of God? Does God have certain people who, no matter what they do, they are going to be lost? And then he has some people, no matter what they do, they are going to be saved. Do you believe that? Because certainly the Bible does say God has a plan for every life. Can we believe that God has some plan for some people to become a Judas and some people to become John? Is it the purpose of God that one shall develop into a Moses and the other one right beside him shall develop into a Pharaoh who end up dead on the shores of the Red Sea? In other words, is Judas as much a part of God's plan as John is? If we can accept that position, then granted, of all men, we are the most miserable, because it will mean that we have such a wicked God. If it be true that God has certain people that are destined to fail in life, they are going to be destroyed, they are going to be even bad. If God has plans like that, then we are in trouble because we have a wicked God. But I submit to you this morning, God does not have such kind of plans. God has plans for our lives. But there is one thing that is very important when we think about God's plan for our lives. We must be willing and cooperate to enter into those purposes that God has. If we fail to do that, the case could end differently. God never planned that any man should go wrong. He is not willing that any man should perish. The Bible clearly says that God is willing that every person should come to repentance and be saved. That's God's plan for everyone. So God loved Moses, but that did not mean he loved Pharaoh less. God loved Judas, but that did not mean John was loved more than he loved Judas. And whatever failure they may have made of their lives, and whatever failure you and me make of our lives, we do not make it because God forces us to do so. In whatever way we go, we do not do so because God planned that we should go wrong. But we do it because of our own willfulness and wicked rebellion against God. In other words, though God plans your life and mine, he cannot, in the very nature of things, force any one of us to enter into his plans. You who are fathers, unfortunately most of us may not be fathers or mothers, but for those of us who are fathers and mothers here, we know that many parents have beautiful plans for their children, right? There is no parent that has bad plans for their child. All parents have wonderful plans for their children. But nevertheless, situations happen when children grow up and despise those plans that their parents have for them. Our children are not ourselves because they have independent wills. They have the capacity for entering into our plans as parents, and that bringing us a lot of joy, but they also have the capacity of despising those purposes and breaking our hearts. That does not mean the parents had any bad plans for the child, but the child must be willing to enter into the parents' plans and reap the benefits of those plans. Or he can choose to go against those plans and become a wreck in their lives. How then do we explain this strange text? For this reason have I raised thee up, that I might show forth my power in thee. Because it is a fact that this death in the Red Sea was not an accidental death. Pharaoh is not dead on the shores of the Red Sea by accident. It is a fact that this corpse here upon the beach is not here by mere chance. The king was flung here by the power of a disappointed, grieved, and rejected God. He lies here dead upon this shore according to the deliberate plan and purpose of God. But while this is true, we need to keep this big fact in mind. Though Pharaoh died here according to the purpose of God, this was not God's first and highest purpose for his life. But Pharaoh resisted and rejected every noble and worthy purpose that God had in his life, and by his own rebellion, he made it impossible for God to realize any purpose in him, save the last and the worst. Do you remember the story in Jeremiah chapter 18? One day the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Jeremiah, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my word. Jeremiah chapter 18 verse 1. You can read the text going down. And Jeremiah went and heard the message. When Jeremiah arrived at the potter's house, three objects once drew his attention. There was a man, the potter himself. And then there was a tool, the wheel, on which the potter worked. And then there was a third item, the clay, on which the potter was actually doing his work. And here, the potter was working on the wheel with the clay in his hand. As Jeremiah looked at the clay in the potter's hand, it was misshapen. It was not any object that you could look at and say, this is a beautiful piece of thing. It was this clay. But as the potter worked on the object of his heart, if he was shaping a cup, this cup was complete somewhere. Where was that? In the mind of the potter. Right? So when the designer is designing, the actual object that he is interested in designing is complete in the mind of the designer. He can see it in that mental position. He can see how it's going to look like. A builder building a house can see how that house would look like well before it's finished. There is a pattern in the mind. And so the potter is working on the clay, molding this clay into the piece that he has in mind, a perfect one. And Isaiah is looking at that situation as the potter tried to bring the plan he has in mind to reality through this clay. But we read that the cup was marred in the making. There was something in the clay that resisted the potter. And what did he do with the cup? As we would have expected, maybe he would have thrown it away. But the Bible says the potter put that clay back and tried to make it into another thing. Right? The potter is working on this clay, and this clay is not coming as he wanted. And so he crushes it and begins to mold it again into another vessel. Now, there is something very important as you think about what is happening here. There is a strong gospel in what the potter is doing. When we resist God's purpose, and awe and put ourselves to become the wreck in this life, God does not just throw us away. He takes us back and tries to mold us into something. But get this right. He is molding this piece into something other than what was the first object. So there was a priority, the best that the potter had in mind. But because this clay resisted that, the potter is forced to think of an alternative object that could be made out of this clay. So he goes to the second best. And the process goes on and on. It doesn't come out. There's something again in the clay resisting the hand of the potter. He crushes it and molds it into another thing, the third best. And that process keeps going. But time comes. The more you work on the clay, it will lose its plasticity. And it can no longer be made into anything. At which point, we will go behind the potter's house. And we are right into the potter's field. And what do we find? Broken vessels. Certainly the potter never set out to make vessels that should end up in his field. He was looking at these vessels that they will become the perfect objects he had in mind. And they will decorate buildings and places. But he did not want these to become broken vessels thrown in his potter's field. But nevertheless, certain of these end up there. There is a truth here, so tremendous, that we're prone to forget. And that truth is that having rejected and resisted God for days, for months and years, God cannot make of us what he could have made if we had entered into his plans from the beginning. There are times when we don't want to give our God the best. So there are people who believe that they cannot listen to God because they have too many other things to do, and they wait until it's too late, and that's the time they want to go to God. Yes, God can make something out of you, but it can never be what he would have made had you entered his purposes early enough. So if you reject God's best for you, then God tries to get you to realize his second best. And if you reject this, then he seeks to bring you to the next best. But remember, God cannot, in the very nature of things, make of us out of a fraction of our life as he could have made out of our whole life. So time will inevitably come when it will no longer be capable of this clay to be shaped into anything that is good at all. And what would be the result? It will be thrown out. So when you think about the story of the potter and what happens as he works with this clay, you begin to understand why Pharaoh is found on the shores of the Red Sea. For we see in Pharaoh's life God doing the very same thing that the potter was actually doing. God had a noble purpose for Pharaoh right at the beginning. He gave Pharaoh the opportunity. He brought to bear all that infinite love and mercy on him for him to begin to see something good out of what God had for his life. The reason Pharaoh ended as he did was not because God did not love him. Neither was it because God did not do his infinite best to make the best out of Pharaoh or to save him. Pharaoh dies here because he resisted and rebelled against everything God put in his way to save him. God tried to make out of Pharaoh something. The first he did was to send a powerful minister to him, Moses. Pharaoh had the privilege of knowing Moses firsthand and to listen to him. And when Moses went to Pharaoh, his words were simple. Thus God of Israel saith, let my people go. That was the message he took to him. And we find Pharaoh looking at that and said, oh, who is the God of Israel that I should listen to him? I do not know him. Well, the truth is there are many people who don't know God. And God does not blame anyone for not knowing him. Jesus said, this is the condemnation, that light came, but men chose to be in darkness. God does not blame anyone for being in darkness. In fact, that's why he makes a way for everyone to come to know him. But the condemnation is this, that light comes and people choose to stay in the darkness. So Pharaoh says, I don't know this God of Israel. I don't know him. And God did not send fire and strike him right there and then. Why did you say don't know me? No. If anything, God pulled out his infinite might and tried to demonstrate himself to Pharaoh, to show Pharaoh who he was. So we find the familiar story. Moses had to perform wonder after wonder in front of Pharaoh, for Pharaoh to understand who this God was. God tried to make himself known to Pharaoh. So Moses performed several miracles, and Pharaoh's magicians replicated them. And so for a moment, his magicians helped him to resist God. But as Moses continued with these wonderful things that he was performing, the magicians could no longer replicate those. And they were forced to acknowledge that this is the finger of God. And they went to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh that what Moses is doing, this is the finger of God. But sad as it is, it's very easy for you to lead someone astray than it is to lead them back. These magicians led Pharaoh to believe that what Moses was doing, they could do. But when they realized it was wrong, and they came to him and tell him, this is the finger of God, acknowledge that there is God here, Pharaoh did not listen. And that's a great danger that we who are Christians should always be mindful of. We may mislead people with the way we lead our own lives, with the things that we do, but to bring those people back, it's much difficult than to lead people astray. And so the magicians failed to reason with Pharaoh that this was the hand of God working. But God did not stop there. God continued to perform miracle after miracle to make himself known to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was called, in this case, to be one of the people who could usher in a new nation. He could be identified with the establishment of the nation of Israel. God had called him to that noble purpose. In that statement, let my people go. But Pharaoh resisted. And God performed all these miracles in front of him. And at times Pharaoh gets afraid of these miracles. And he begins to negotiate with God. To seek some kind of compromises between what he could do. Driven by fear, he goes and tells Moses, said, okay, I'm going to let the people go, but not all of them. Let only the men go. Leave the children behind. That was his first compromise. I'll let them go, but only the men should go. Leave the children behind. Well, the truth is Satan knows much that as long as we leave our children behind, we can never save the world. The influence of those children will be strong enough to go against every effort for righteous acts in this world. And Satan said, well, take your old men, go with them, but leave your children behind here. But I'm glad Moses said, like, no, we don't want to leave them. We want to go with them. We want to go with our children. And that's a strong warning to those of us who are parents. We cannot afford to leave our children in the world and focus on saving the older generation only. God expects that we move out of the world together with our children. And the next thing, Pharaoh said, well, I'm going to let you and the children go, but you must leave your cattle and sheep behind. What does Pharaoh say? Again, Pharaoh said, well, you can go as long as your business interests stay in Egypt. There is no problem. Well, the Bible says where your wealth lies, there your heart will lie also, isn't it? And this same temptation comes to us as Christians as we live daily. Satan always entices us. Well, as long as your Christianity is only on Sabbath and you don't care about it from Sunday to Friday, I don't mind. You can go to church on Sabbath as long as you don't care about it after. As long as you don't bring God into your work, that's good enough. Your business interest, you can leave God out of that. You can go to a God meeting once a week. That's good enough with me. And that's what he was saying here. Take your children and you go, but leave your business interests, leave your economy, leave your wealth behind. Don't we face similar challenges today? But the religion that does not permeate and purify and uplift and sanctify businesses and business relations is not the religion of Christ. And lastly, Pharaoh offered a third compromise. Said, I will let the people go, but they must not go far. You know, think of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was not just a simple person that you could think of. This was a guy who was well learned in all the knowledge of Egypt, right? If there was the best universities in Egypt, you can believe that this guy, before he became Pharaoh, went through all those. He was a very intelligent person and he knew exactly what he was talking about. When he said, you can go, but don't go very far. He was making a provision to get these people back. So their leaving Egypt was only going to be temporary. They will still be within reach and he can bring them back should he desire to do so. And the same challenge happened to us. There are many people today who can listen to the voice of God and get convicted and promise that they would rather follow God, but they don't want to make a complete commitment. There are many people say, yes, I understand this, but I want to see how I can get along with church. I cannot make a commitment to become a full Christian because I want to see how I can get along with it. It's the same argument Pharaoh was using here. Because in a sense, by saying I do not want to fully commit myself, what you're trying to say is I'm making provision to get back. That's why I don't want to be committed to it. Because if tomorrow I decided not to be part of it, then I just walk. And here is a man who has decided to be a Christian, but he wants to join the church because he wants to see how he gets along with it. Making a provision to go back. But the Bible clearly tells us that what God expects is a complete break with the past if we decide to follow him. So, but the prejudice that Pharaoh continued making grew worse and worse. But the point is, Pharaoh was doing all these things not because he wanted to listen to God. He was doing these things because he was afraid of what was happening. And fear was motivating him to do what he was doing. The terrible storms that came around threatened him and says, Moses, come here. I will let them go. But just don't go very far. And finally, God was forced to bring Pharaoh to kneel beside the coffin of his own son for him to understand who the God of heaven was. And when Pharaoh knelt beside the coffin of the future prince of Egypt, he felt it was enough. Now he could obey. So he said, let the children of Israel go. Now not just going, but let them hasten to leave Egypt. But sad to say that the grass had hardly grown green on the grave of his son, that when Pharaoh decided to go back against that promise. And so he marshaled his forces and rushed after the Egyptians, the children of Israel, to take them back. And when he saw them, with the mountains on the east and the west, and the Red Sea in front of them, and him and his mighty forces coming behind them, boxing them as it were, He was excited with that. What sweet revenge am I going to have with these people? And as he kept his eyes on the children of Israel, something happened. The mighty Red Sea parted. And he saw these children of Israel walking down there. Still he had a chance to know who this God was. Because in his entire life, that had never happened. And he saw the hand of this God parting the Red Sea. But Pharaoh hardened, as it were, resisting everything God put in his way to save him. He went headlong into that destruction. And he looked and said, wherever the children of Israel can go, Egyptians can go too. So he marshaled his forces right into the Red Sea. And God looked and said, enough is enough. You have resisted every good intention I had. And you have brought yourself to this. And so the two walls of the waters of the Red Sea crashed back together. And we find Pharaoh lying dead on the shores of the Red Sea. Why? Was it because God did not do enough to save him? No. But because he could not enter into God's purposes. He did not want to be part of God's plans for his life. He resisted God with such strength and might that it took all those 10 miracles happening in Egypt, but none of them could make Pharaoh decide to stand on the side of God. And finally, when we read what the Bible says, that for this cause I raised thee up, to show forth my strength, God's purpose was accomplished. But Pharaoh's worst was not because God did not love him, but because he resisted. As we live today, God is putting so many things in our way that perhaps we could stop and think and decide to enter into God's purposes for our lives, which the Bible clearly says they are good. God's purposes for each of us are for the good. They are not evil. But we must be willing to enter into those purposes.
God is making a way,
So God wants each one of us to come to him. Give our lives to him. And let him lead. But should we resist, God still tries to take us to second best. Should we resist, we go to the next best. Until there is nothing more God can do with us. And so he leaves us to our own ends. But his power is still there. It is my prayer that God would help us to follow his leading. He is patient with us today, but time will come when mercy will no longer plead for the guilty inhabitants of this world. May God give us the heart to realize his love for us. Amen.